This talk is called the Social Coding Contract. Bad segue. But this is, because of the tight time slots here, this is the contracted edition. Like Zara mentioned, I'm from far away. I live in the state of Ohio. If you're not familiar with your flyover state geography, it's that one. I came yesterday via plane, and that's exactly the flight we took, and I've never been to New York City before, so I'm super nervous. I don't do big cities well, so please be gentle with me. I'm Justin. Please tweet me at Searls. I'd love to be your Twitter friend. I'm always looking to make new friends. Like I said, never been to New York City before, and I have none. I come from a really great software agency called Test Double. If you would like to say hello, that's an email address. Open source is good, duh. Of course. Businesses work with other businesses on tools that they share with the world for free. Startups, new products, new applications, new businesses can be launched from this mountain of free stuff and just build a little itty bitty bit of custom code on top, creating new businesses. And never really before in the history of humanity has like one person from the comfort of their own home being able to do a little bit of work that can literally change how the world works. But is open source good, really? I mean, whenever I want to share an upstream patch at work, people give me a lot of crap about it, much less if I want to like open source extract a new library. And like a lot of the startups that we see are really building these maintainability time bombs as they hoover up all this free stuff that they don't understand. And most of the maintainers, myself included, tend to feel pretty burnt out giving free tech support to the universe 24/7. So what I'm here to do today is talk about some of the sort of systemic social issues that face us in open source so that we can get in the habit of doing that together more often, so that we can collectively gain a sense of urgency, which might lead to some good ideas, and hopefully only then can we hope to ever see solutions to these kinds of problems. And maybe that would proffer some kind of relief, and then we're done. But because of the 26-minute talk timeline, I'm just here to complain. So we're just going to focus on the top left quadrant. We're going to talk about four big things. One, the teetering sensation we feel as we stand on top of a Jenga tower of dependencies. Pull back the curtain a little bit, show what it's like to be an open source maintainer. Talk a little bit about trust and its implications in open source. And also, just share some deep thoughts about the social nature of open source and where I think things are going to go in the future. I like to start talks off with term definitions. So this is the word ideology. A lot of people think of the word ideology to mean like political affiliation, but I like this definition a lot more. It's they do not know it, but they are doing it. Where ideology is actually like the subtext. It's the negative space that drives our actions without us really consciously thinking about it. That's a quote from a fellow named Karl Marx. He wrote that in the book Capital, and Capital is an interesting book for this topic because it sits at this intersection between philosophy and economics. Just like open source. We have this altruistic share-alike mentality, but then there's all these companies raising a bunch of money and making money hand over fist on open source technologies. If we think about it from the traditional economic progress perspective, like the arc of time, in what it's like to consume stuff. In the beginning, everything was pretty rough. Every person was out for themselves, focused mostly on survival. But then as groups of people formed, specializations emerged. Like you could go to one person, a farmer for your veggies, another person for your meats, and through economies of scale, this opened the door to human culture developing, recreation, and art. Industrialization inverted that so that we had one place we could go to and fill up a shopping cart full of all the different commodities we would need, giving us even more time to explore more new, interesting avenues of humanity. And the internet's made it stupid easy, right? Like from your iPad, you can order everything you want and get 2-day shipped to your house. So clearly, this is progress in the direction of getting what we want faster and more easily and with less labor. But where does that progress lead us? Last year, there was a story speculating that Amazon was actually using big data to guess what you're going to purchase before you buy it, shipping it to local distribution centers so that they could offer you same-day shipping on a bunch of items. And for a lot of people, that really creeped them out because at a certain point, just like this no longer feels like they're actually actively purchasing something as much as just consenting to purchase that somebody else is deciding for them. So that's one example of an unintended consequence of that progress. Another one you're probably familiar with is the documentary Food, Inc., where it looks at the industrialization of our food system. But I want to pause here to say, like, look at that tagline. You'll never look at dinner the same way. And I feel like it would have been way more honest if the tagline had said, for like at least a month. Because when you look at progress as optimizing for just one or two particular attributes, it'll go in that direction, but because of the blind spot, awfulness will just kind of accrete, as if naturally. And at some point, it's big enough, it's tall enough for us all to freak out about it. And that's the moment we want to like just change it. We want to turn on a dime. But these systems are way too big. We can't do that so quickly. And the best case scenario is it only gets a little bit worse before we can all collectively start making it better. So let's talk about dependency management. When we talk about dependencies and we chart a similar kind of progression of how it's gotten easier to consume them over time, in the beginning, things were really rough. If you had some code out on the internet, maybe did some encryption for you or something, you'd find the header files, the C files, you'd pull them down into your code base, you'd depend on them, and then from that moment forth, they were your problem. If they had to be updated or fixed or something, they kind of lived on as part of your application, which was a lot of work. But it meant you had to understand them. Makefiles helped us to, and linking, dynamic linking helped us to logically depend on stuff instead of physically depend on it. That way, maybe we pull down something like libxml in a big tarball, we run make, and as long as the versions are all right, it gets dynamically linked with our application, and then we can view it as other, as separate. Jar files, Java's philosophy of write once, run everywhere was really revolutionary, right? Because I could go to a website, download a jar file, put it on my class path, and then use it very reliably. In fact, this was the moment when it became convenient enough to pull in a dependency that our dependencies started asking, hey, we have dependencies too, you need to go download Apache Commons or this other jar. And so when our dependencies have dependencies, we call that, in dependency parlance, we call that a transitive dependency. Ruby took this a step further and was like, well, look, we got all these, if our dependencies are going to have dependencies, maybe we should just, you list them out in a file, these are all the things you want, and then Bundler does the job of resolving all the versions, making sure that you get the right versions of stuff, and then also recursing down the tree of all the transitive dependencies, where now our transitive dependencies have dependencies and so on and so forth. NPM takes this further still, because there's nothing in the Node.js runtime that prevents us from loading the same library at multiple version points, right, because of how module works. So in a trivial or a naive implementation of something like NPM, what you could do is you could just suck down all of your dependencies right in a tree, suck down all of its dependencies, suck down all of its dependencies, and so on. And obviously in like NPM 3, NPM 2 and earlier, you could dedupe, and nowadays we get as flat a structure as possible by default with NPM 3. But this resulted in really deep trees, and when I was starting out as a Node maintainer of publishing open source, I'd very often, all my projects would get complaints from Windows users because I'd brush up against the Windows max file path limit of 256 characters, and my library would no longer be usable to them unless they like installed right at the C drive. So that was crazy. All of this is, these are examples of the progress we're getting is short-term convenience of adoption, of pulling stuff in and using it really, really quickly. And it's available to us for the low, low price of long-term fragility, building systems we don't understand. Louis C.K., I think he's from New York, right? He talked about this in a stand-up routine.
It's true. Everything that makes you happy is going to end at some point, and nothing good ends well. It's like if you buy a puppy, you're bringing it home to your family saying, hey, look, everyone, we're all going to cry soon. Look at what I brought home. I brought home us crying in a few years. Here we go. Countdown to sorrow with a puppy.
So I come to you from the Ruby community for the most part, and in the Ruby community, our version of Louis C.K. is a guy named Gary Bernhardt. Gary had this great quote I really love. He said, build a small but non-trivial Rails app. An empty app has 50 gem dependencies, but yours will have 75 to 100. Now go away for 6 months. Come back and update all your dependencies. Your app no longer works. But it's easy to get started. It's easy to start a Jekyll blog. It's easy to install Sass. It's easy to generate a Rails app. Always easy right now, never in a year, because progress is about adoption. So we all, when you ask, like, hey, what's your app? Show me your app. We all think that our app is the code that we're writing. That's our intuition. That's where we walk around all day. But if upon any amount of reflection, we'd all agree that what our app really is everything that we're shipping into production. So we live at this weird crossroads where it's never been easier to be a developer to ship something, and yet the day one stuff that we're shipping has never been more inherently intrinsically complex. I think Steve's awesome Electron talk earlier was a great example of that. It's so awesome how quickly we can get up and running. It's kind of crazy that we take 2 language runtimes and have to smash them together to make it happen, with all of the sort of like translation that goes on. A specific example, we're talking about NPM. As a library maintainer in NPM, let's pretend that these are all dependencies, little shapes, and that orange thing, I depend on it at version C, and one of my dependencies depends on it at version B, and one of its dependencies depends on it on version A. Now, when this happens, what happens when I invoke that dependency and I get a domain object back from it, and then I foolishly, admittedly, pass that into my dependency, who passes it into his? I'm a library author. I write a lot of modules. Do I ever test for the case where one version of my module is talking to another version of that module? Absolutely not. So will it work? Will it blow up? I don't know. And if I don't know as the maintainer, you probably don't know as a consumer. And if we're all using relatively loose version specifiers in our packages, then stuff might just blow up. Another instance is that maybe as a library author, I'm very fixed. I fix all of my versions very cautiously and conservatively, but I can't control my transitive dependency version, so how it lists that. So if orange triangle specifies that it depends on red square at version asterisk, then that means that at install time, you just get the latest and greatest no matter what. And I can't, as the top level thing, can't control that on behalf of my users. So one day, every new install started failing for our biggest project called Lyman.js. And what we found was that that orange triangle was blowing up because an incompatible API change had been made to red square, and it was, that person didn't do a good semver job, but that becomes my problem now. So we had to put out the fire because the person had abandoned the project by forking and then setting explicitly the last working version, and then push that up. And now we own this fork of this thing that we still don't understand, and if there's ever any patches or security or stuff, that's just gonna, atrophy and wither for all of our end users, because if it wasn't for this talk, I'd have forgotten about it by now. So we all understand the code we write is the code that we need, and the code we depend on is there for convenience. It helps us get started. But once we start thinking about it, of course, are transitive dependencies that confer some complexity. And as we dig deeper, it starts to feel riskier and murkier. And deeper still, it starts to feel kind of mysterious. So on one hand, it's easy to joke and about how backwards and old and painful things like makefiles were. But many old C projects, when you run make, they still build 30 years later. How confident are you that when you run npm install and npm test on your module, it's going to still work in 5 years? I'm not. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the people making all of these dependencies and building this big pyramid, what it's like to be an open source maintainer. First of all, I like to say open source maintainers are not rock stars. Really, what I think of them as is just extra early adopters. How you become a maintainer, you Google for a thing you wish existed. It doesn't exist. You turn around and you start work on making it yourself. A slightly less early adopter could very well the next day go Google for the same thing and find, oh, look, somebody else published this. That's great. And I don't know if you like music and you're into indie music and you find a band that no one else has heard of. For some reason, there's this impulse of let's share it. I'm gonna get some street cred for sharing this in public. So people post at Hacker News, they get online, they get excited about this thing, and the maintainer sees, hey, look, people are talking about my stuff, and they get stars in their eyes. They realize wow, it's a bit of an ego stroke to have somebody use my stuff. But early adopters, especially on Hacker News, complain, oh, well, it doesn't do X or Y or Z, and suddenly a maintainer realizes, crap, my emotions are directly affected by other people's opinions of my work. And the nice thing about the early adopters, though, is that they're no less competent than maintainers, and they can send pull requests, and often do, that go fix those early things. Now the maintainer's happy again. And suddenly, my happiness is very closely associated with the stars on GitHub. So the first release of any open source thing is very often just scratching the itch that one person has, and maybe they've got just one clear path of a problem, and version 001 solves that problem for them, but there's going to be some jagged edges. And so those pull requests come in from the other early adopters and help round it out to make it massive, ready for mass consumption. And so maybe at this point, that's when you should call it version 1.0.0. It's stable API and market as such. But if you're like me and you're afraid of the ramifications of semantic versioning, that's your version 0.84.0, and it's ready for other people to start using. This is a crucial moment in any project, and at this moment, this is the conversation that should happen. The maintainer should say, hey, let's own this together. Let's start growing the base of people who own this thing, and I'm sure anyone would be excited to hear that. I'd even settle for, hey, I'll give you commit bit, and I'm sure people would be willing to help triage and merge in some pull requests sometimes. But because that conversation doesn't happen, they may as well say, hey, let's never communicate again. Their early adopters say, okay, sounds good, bye forever, and then they're off, because they're early adopters. They're going to find some new shiny thing, and they're going to move on. Why is it that maintainers don't just share control at that moment? I think it's because they mispredict how much happiness that control is going to give them over time. Because so far, they built a thing, they got attention for it, they got to version 1.0, they just draw a straight line, they're like, oh my god, this is going to make me so happy. But that's not how it really goes, because late adopters are very different, and they'll disabuse them of this happiness. So a maintainer, remember, this already solves their problem. I'm going to go a month without committing to this project. Some new thing, like they're like early adopters too, is going to come along, distract them, and whisk them away. And this thing's just effectively, for their purposes, done. But then the late adopter appears. And from their perspective, it's like, oh, look, no recent commits. That sounds stable. 800 stars, no one's going to fire me for using this thing. And when you think of the library as a well-known quantity, it's at this stage that you have to consider. And think of this from your own perspective. When you're using a library, your needs are never going to totally match up to what that library does. And if you're a good open source citizen, everything that is in that unshaded area is really just a negotiation. Like, how am I going to deal with how this dependency doesn't do exactly what I want to do? I could contribute to it. I could open a really good issue about it. I could fork it. I could not use it. Or I could just complain. And this is where entitled GitHub threads come from, and they're the bane of any open source maintainer's existence. They're missing obvious important features. We thought that this was a well-written and good library, but it doesn't support our silly nonsense use case. And I reply as kindly as I can. I didn't know it had to do all this silly nonsense. Could you please explain why it's important? And then all of their corporate coworkers go sign up for free GitHub accounts and just to +1 the issue. And the implication here is that the maintainer's bad, and he should feel bad, and he should do free labor for us. And it's probably a weekend. I'm probably at the park with my spouse, having a nice, relaxing day, and now I'm glued to my phone, and I'm like, sorry, wife, get in the car, and I hack and commit all weekend long, so I can come back to the same thread and say, I just spent all weekend building this thing for you. Can someone please verify that it meets your needs? And of course, we all know the next step. And now I'm sad, right? Because I just took this thing that was like a labor of love that served a purpose for me, and I built this, I diverted some logical branch with some custom stuff that I don't need, that I'm probably not going to personally use, but now I have to test for and I have to maintain forever and ever. So it doesn't take very many of those kinds of features before you start to hate all of the projects that you build. In fact, I hate most of my repos. I've got hundreds. If you want one, ask. I'll give you one, just at random. Seriously, I'll be at the party tonight. We'll hang out, and I'll just transfer ownership. So those are people that aren't even trying to hurt you. But what about trolls who are actually actively malicious? Remember, open source maintainers, they're not rock stars. They're just people too. And when I think of maintainers, maybe this person has 5,000 followers, and they've got a lot. Anyone who follows them might think, yeah, sure, there's probably a couple trolls in the audience, and that's how it looks on paper. But from the maintainer's perspective, it might be the case that the overwhelming input that they're actually getting from the community are really, really abrasive trolls. And when the maintainer disappears, everyone's shocked by this because they don't see that in the asymmetric nature of Twitter. So Seth Vargo, he had just a handful of people in the chef community that actually drove him out of the chef company and the chef community because he was being harassed by just a handful, and everyone was shocked when that happened, and it was really disappointing. So if you view this as the curve, obviously that's going to make you less happy, and it's now a little bit too late. The maintainer's like, man, I'm burnt out. Can somebody please help me? Cry for help, please, will somebody maintain this with me? And of course, it's too late at that point, and that's how a lot of projects die and why a lot of projects die. But open source projects tend to survive when the community grows alongside them in proportion and contributes back, and that the maintainer is open to sharing that control. Let's talk a little bit about trust. So open source requires adoption, right? And in order for us to adopt stuff, we have to trust that it works. We, of course, have the explicit trust, the dependencies that we actually depend on, as well as implicit trust. We're trusting that our dependencies are trusting other dependencies well. But we generally don't vet that stuff. But there's a lot of trust going on. How do we get people to trust us? The answer, of course, is marketing. So let's talk about some open source marketing over time. Consider Linus Torvalds' 1991 announcement of Linux. He did this to the Minix user group. Mailing list, and he wrote this nice little email, but it's really bad marketing. I mean, there's no catchy name. He makes a self-deprecating remark right in the header, and then he goes totally off message and says, oh, it'll only ever work on my niche little hard disk, which isn't really good marketing. So Linux, the thing that runs almost all the servers in the world, including Hacker News, wouldn't have made the front page of Hacker News if he'd announced it like that today. Over time, Websites became pretty common. Late 90s, we're trying to get into the enterprise with open source. This is the Java Apache Ant project, a build tool for Java. And look at all this stuff. I mean, they had a fancy logo. They had all this website stuff. They had a mission statement. They were they affiliated themselves with the Apache Foundation to try to confer trust to users. But as time's gone on, it's been less about trust because we have so many dependencies. We don't have time to read all of their mission statements. We have less time to vet them. So the GitHub Markdown README has become kind of the canonical thing. We expect to see a real quick intro, some snappy steps so we can just copy and paste the code, put it in our thing, and be done. And where we get our trust from are these mostly green badges up at the top. Only one yellow. Okay. So, big companies see the money in open source. It's a recruiting tool, so they are spending lots of marketing money on their open source projects. This is Yeoman from Google, and obviously if you just look at the page, it's a project where a diverse group of engineers are building a rocket that has gradients and an authoritative tagline, a one-liner to get started with a little walkthrough tutorial thing, and it can generate 1,000 different types of projects, which is 999 too many. All that to say, that's just our explicit trust of the dependencies we actually use. Who's got time to vet transitive dependencies? You probably won't, but you should at least think about the fact that the more people you trust, the more people you don't even realize you're trusting when you pull in any dependency into your project. Not to say that you shouldn't, but it's just something to be cognizant of. Everything around us is optimized for adoption. That is what the march of progress of open source tooling has been so far, make it easier to suck new stuff in. So recognize when projects are marketing to you. Marketing is not good or bad. I write open source. I want you to use it. I'll try to convince you to use it. But understand that it's marketing. It's up to you to discern whether it's the best fit for your needs or not. Lastly, I want to share some deep thoughts about the social side of things. Unfortunately, all of the stick figures in this talk were a total lie because they intimate that open source is a thing that happens between humans in real life, and it's not, because how we actually communicate, of course, is mostly email and GitHub issues and Twitter. It's all just asynchronous text. So for most intents and purposes, we're no more than an avatar, a username, some emoji once in a while, and text on a screen. Evie had this tweet that I really related to, and it made me super sad. It's fucked up that a lot of modern discourse is optimized for whoever has the fewest feelings and the most free time, and that's open source. So if there's ever uncertainty or ambiguity between people and communicating remotely, disagreement, if that boils up to simmering disdain, then of course, email's probably not the best way to have the conversation. Asynchronous text isn't that great. And whenever I find that I'm having an emotional reaction that I can't convey successfully in any kind of discourse, I try to bump up to a higher fidelity way of communicating, like maybe real-time chat. Or, they can hear my voice cracking if I call them. Or if I'm making somebody cry, I can see it on a video chat. And, there's something magical about human physiology where if you get two people who really viciously disagree with each other into the same room, they tend to find a way to find peace and find some kind of common ground in a way that doesn't happen on Twitter, and I don't know why that is. Also, the strategy can be really great. Where do trolls get their power? It's from anonymity and a perceived lack of consequences. So if you're ever finding somebody's getting harassed in a thread, you could say, hey, let's have a video chat about that, and then the troll disappears. Pro tip. So it'd be really cool if our tools were encouraging us to have higher fidelity communication. Like, for example, in a GitHub issue here, instead of just close and comment, it'd be great if I could just start a real-time chat, like with Gitter, or build a live example, like with JSBin, or right from there, schedule a pairing session on my Nitrous IO box to try to opt me into more easily, because it takes effort. It pushes us out of our comfort zone to have to talk to other humans. It'd be great if our tools were more supportive of this. So what does the future hold? One last thing here is I said things were awful, right, which is kind of unfair, and I said that things were going to get awfuler, so it's only fair of me to speculate what that inflection point looks like before things get better. Last year at GoGaRuko, Yehuda Katz gave this talk about Rust, and he said Rust enables a whole new generation of high-level programmers to write systems-level code. At first, I was just thinking about this talk and oh my god, high-level code's a mess. This is crazy, that sounds terrible. But then as I thought about it more, I realized maybe that'll reciprocate. Maybe this will actually all work out. If we think about where innovation in open source has been happening over time, in the beginning it was all happening in low-level systems because that's all that there was. And over time we moved up, but then the e-commerce revolution and the World Wide Web thing of the 90s all the innovation that for a long time was just all happening up at this top level. And only recently, as we started to brush up against Moore's Law, are we seeing investment in languages like Rust and Go again that are kind of conferring some of this modernity down to systems level engineering. But when we think of our culture today about dependencies as well as open source tooling, it's mostly kind of coupled to our concepts of high-level web applications. So asking yourself, how is that going to translate? Will we just cargo cult it, or will it work out okay? I think is worth exploring. One big difference, of course, between high-level web apps and real-time systems is that real-time systems often have really grave consequences. What's the worst thing that could happen if your web app crashes, right? Healthcare.gov. It blows up for like a month and a half. It's a national crisis. People can't sign up for new healthcare, and it was genuinely a real shame. But if you're a systems engineer and you look at that, this is a lot more serious. There's a guy on the table on the Da Vinci machine right there, and if your code breaks, he bleeds out. That's like an order of magnitude more serious. So when I talk to my systems level engineering friends about how they have to use C and how nothing about their lives seems very convenient compared to my life, one of the things that they talk about is that adopting a dependency outsources their understanding of how to do a task, and they often can't make that wager in a real-time system. So they view it as like layering on, they've got their application responsibilities on the right, a dependency might confer some of that for them, and when they layer it on, everything in this newly shaded area becomes kind of like an understanding debt. The dependency is doing a job that we think we understand for us, but we don't know or understand how it's doing that job. And typically, understanding debt, and we incur it as well, is paid down by iterating on something. We find out if it's really inefficient, or if the API is hard to use, or if it's got bugs. Hosted versus embedded systems are very different, right? Hosted systems are centralized. Embedded systems are usually fabbed and shipped. Hosted systems usually don't live very long before being rewritten, but embedded systems have to live for a long time. Hosted systems usually have a live team, but some embedded systems just have an RMA process. Usually on our hosted systems, we have more than enough RAM and CPU to incur expensive, poorly understood dependencies, but embedded systems usually have very, very strict resource constraints. And of course, hosted systems we can continuously deliver now. We can easily patch stuff, but often embedded systems like our smart fridges, when there's a bash exploit, it's game over. So it's very easy to iterate down our understanding debt on the left, and very hard to iterate down our understanding debt on the right. And so as a result, if iterative releases aren't possible, don't outsource your understanding. Qualify the tools that you use. Understand much more carefully what those dependencies are doing, and move a little bit more cautiously. So like I said earlier, most open source tools are really just a product of the nature of web development and all of that stuff that we saw on the left side of that screen. And so my hope is that if we start with today's perspective and then we build a lot of similar tools, like if Tom's here building cargo for Rust, my hope is that that'll feed back to us, and we'll all be able to walk with a little bit more caution and a little bit more appreciation for understanding our dependencies. So we talked about a lot of stuff today in all these different categories and not a whole lot of time. But my takeaway here is I really think open source can be a lot better. Companies, open source for most companies is like a corporate welfare program, and they don't really give back. But we can all encourage our employers to invest the time to look for bugs, or only really big companies can afford to audit fundamental stuff like Bash and OpenSSL for security vulnerabilities. Startups, I think, could stand to understand the fact that they really should understand the dependencies that they're using if they're going to build maintainable systems. And if they don't have the time, if they got to ship out the door and they don't have the time to understand, then probably it's best to advise them, look, you probably want to rewrite version 2 unless you're going to make a gigantic mess of things and put your business at risk. Open source maintainers, I think, would be a lot happier if they shared control earlier on in the life of a project, and a lot happier if more people were opting into offering their help. And that's something that all of us can do. So that's my talk. My name's Justin. Please contact me, get a hold of me. Like I said, TestDouble is an agency where we do custom software development. We work with teams. We love working with great developers. So if your team is looking for developers and would like to work with us, we'd love to talk to you. We're, like everyone else, we're always interviewing too. So if you'd like to work in a remote agency model, please email us. Also, whether you want to chat tonight at the after party or just grab a sticker from me, I've got stickers, and I'd like to chat. So once again, you've been a fantastic audience. Thank you so much for inviting me here and sharing your time.